Our first speaker was born and raised in Astoria, Queens. He's probably the only person on the planet to have appeared in both a martial arts flick with Billy Tabo Blanks and a radical event with Derek Jensen. He's the author of 9 books, most recently Self-Defense for Radicals. He's a regular writer for Planet Green and can be found on the web at mickeyz.net. He's been an ethical vegan for 15 years. So welcome, Mickey Z.
Let me first say thank you for including me on this panel. I appreciate it. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to Michelle, of course, and to all of you for choosing to spend your Sunday afternoon with us. I know there are many, many choices here, and we really, really appreciate that you've chosen this panel. In an effort to have what happens here today perhaps have some carryover afterwards, I like to appropriate a tactic that I learned during my 12 years in Catholic school. And when you go to Catholic school, you spend a lot of time in church, and there was one thing I learned that I still use today. So I'm going to ask each of you to turn to the person on either side of you, in front of you, behind you, etc. Shake hands, say hello, introduce yourself, exchange phone numbers. Maybe say these guys.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Gail.
Hi, I'm Catherine. Hi, I'm Caitlin.
All right, that wasn't too bad, right? And as mentioned, we will pass around the hand sanitizer, this and stuff outside. And now that we're all on a first name basis, I guess I should warn you that this panel has not been approved by the Department of Homeland Security, so you all hear at your own risk. This is the point where at least one of the speakers implores everyone in the audience to turn off their cell phones. And anybody who's seen me do an event like this knows I do quite the opposite, and it's particularly relevant for me to explain to you why, because it ties into what we're doing here today. I suggest you leave your cell phones on, because every time someone's phone rings, we can contemplate the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We would do that because one of the primary components of cell phone circuitry is a metallic ore called columbite tantalite, aka coltan, most of which is found in the African nation of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which just so happens to be embroiled in a particularly brutal civil war for more than 10 years. When I say particularly brutal, I mean even by today's insane standards. And both sides in this civil war are using child labor to mine and sell coltan to fund their military mayhem and feed our cell phone addictions. And it gets worse. The world's largest primate, the eastern lowland gorilla, has as its habitat the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in particular where the coltan is found. So I probably don't have to tell you what's being done to the world's largest primate in the name of using child labor to mine and sell coltan to fund a civil war and feed our addictions. But I could sum it up in one little factoid. In the past 5 years, the population of the eastern lowland gorilla has declined by 90%. So go ahead, leave your cell phones on. I guess we can only hope that some clever entrepreneur has recorded the cry of the eastern lowland gorilla, so long after it's extinct we can use that cry as a ringtone. Khalil asked me to kick things off a bit here, and I guess in a way throw down the gauntlet, as it were. And to begin with, I'm going to offer a quote from the book or the movie Grapes of Wrath, as spoken by one of the lead characters, Tom Joad. And Tom says, maybe we're not all individual souls, but maybe we're all part of one big soul. Incredibly basic, I know, but within that simplicity lies what I believe to be the secret. For if we were to look upon all living things, including ourselves, as part of one collective soul, how could we not defend this soul by any means necessary? Now, what do I mean by collective soul? To understand this concept requires us to make connections which for the most part are not being made, in particularly on the left. In fact, most disturbingly on the left. Now I discussed some connections in the cell phone bit to begin with, but here's another idea of what I mean. Let's say a jaguar, a rapidly disappearing species. In Central or South America, its habitat long stolen by the progress of Homo sapiens, is starving. So it creeps onto one of the farms that's now on its former habitat, and it kills and eats a cow in order to survive. The reaction would be predictable. Human beings would be united in outrage. The jaguar would be called a pest. It would be promptly hunted down and killed without contemplation or penalty. After all, we can't let one of those beasts kill one of our beasts, can we? That's our job. And it's our job to tear down the rainforest so the cow had room to get fat in the first place. And it's our job to slaughter the cow, eat it, and get fat ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, it's our job to pretend we have nothing to do with this destructive cycle. In fact, pretend this culture doesn't even exist. Pretend we have nothing to do with the millions of animals tortured and murdered in laboratories each year, the millions of animals tortured and murdered for fur each year, the billions of animals tortured and murdered for food each year. Like all the issues here at the Left Forum, it comes down to perceptions. Our perceptions shape our reality. And my reality on this issue is that we need a far more holistic concept of radical activism, but unfortunately the connections I'm talking about are not being made, most disturbingly by those on the left. Now what do I mean by left? I'm going to cast a pretty broad net here, but to begin with I'm going to offer a little bit that Cornel West said a couple of years ago right here at the Left Forum when he was describing what it meant to be a leftist. Come on in. Everybody's welcome. All right, so a couple of years ago Cornel West said, quote, "If you are concerned about structural violence, if you're concerned about exploitation at the workplace, if you're concerned about institutionalized contempt against gay brothers and lesbian sisters, if you're concerned about organized hatred against peoples of color, if you're concerned about the subordination of women, that's not cheap PC chit-chat, that is a calling that you're willing to fight against and try to understand the sources of that social misery at the structural and institutional level and at the existential and the personal level. That's what it means, in part, to be a leftist," close quote. Now, of course, he said in part. But it's interesting that someone could discuss the structural, institutional, existential, and personal levels of the culture of violence and not use words like environment, land base, ecosystem, extinction, or animals. But this isn't too shocking if you're paying attention. After all, on the Left Forum website, if you were looking for this panel, they broke it down into issues. There was no animal rights link on the Left Forum website. It's been a long time that this particular issue is treated on the left as a stepchild of sorts. This gathering is called Rekindling the Radical Imagination. So maybe if we just had a little less Marxist theory and a little bit more direct action, but I digress. This is typical of how animal rights activism is viewed all across the full spectrum, not just the left. Come on in. As I said, this is typical of how animal rights activism is viewed not just by the left, but across the full spectrum. For example, in the right wing or the mainstream, or perhaps I'm being redundant, perhaps anyone who doesn't call themselves a leftist, animal rights activists, vegan activists, dark green eco activists are universally called terrorists. Which makes me wonder, how exactly does one qualify as a terrorist in 2010 America?
Breathe.
Because by today's standards, you can pack a calf into a veal crate, you can pump food down a goose's gullet, you can blind and dissect a monkey, and you can grind up live male chicks to fertilize your fields, and you'd run no risk of being called a terrorist.
Oh, I've been sitting in the wrong room for 20 minutes.
You could also clear-cut forests, blow off mountaintops in search of coal, and drag trolling nets across the ocean floor. And you would garner virtually no attention at all, let alone be called a terrorist. But if you choose a lifestyle of compassion and logic, you speak out against vivisection, and you protest the use of fur, you, says the mainstream and the right at least, deserve an orange jumpsuit and a one-way ticket to Guantanamo. Literally. Consider the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act of 2006, the AETA, which specifically targets anyone who, quote, intentionally damages or causes the loss of any real or personal property, including animals or records, used by animal enterprise. And then it goes further, or any real or personal property of a person or entity having a connection to, relationship with, or transactions with an animal enterprise.